So, Mark, the reason I was interested in talking to you, in 2006, we did that event at the University of Minnesota together and
Yeah.
had a great conversation about R. Kelly. Really, I have all these questions, and I'm coming to people I really respect. You've written about him, you've thought about him. Your work is astounding about everything, not just R. Kelly. And I'm trying to find answers. What does R. Kelly mean to you today? Let's start there. You have a chapter about him in your new book.
Yeah. In some ways, R. Kelly's damaged goods. I don't think for particularly my generation of folks who have in some ways grown up listening to his music, there's no way to think about him and not think about these charges.
Yeah.
And the irony is that, as a fully mature artist, not necessarily as a fully mature person, as a fully mature artist, the music that he's done really since these charges have broke, some of that stuff has been pretty phenomenal musically.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that, we haven't been able to literally enjoy his music because of these other dynamics. You see in him, though, a sense that he has moved on because he didn't have much of a choice, really, in that matter. His musical persona is looking back, and not back in terms of his career, but in terms of, what black music looked like, sounded like 30 or 40 years ago, which from a branding standpoint for R. Kelly, it was probably a genius move. But it's really hard to disconnect, R. Kelly, the musical person, from the R. Kelly that we know is so capable of this kind of problematic behavior. The one thing that has changed for me in terms of thinking about R. Kelly, and I know he tried to delve into some of this in his memoir for last year, is that you also get the feeling that as abusive as R. Kelly has been accused of being, that there probably was some significant abuse in his own childhood and background that he never was able to deal with. And I always have this fundamental thing: if we're going to hold R. Kelly accountable, we have to hold a larger society accountable for not protecting young men and girls who also are in these conditions when they're young.
Sure.
R. Kelly is not produced in a vacuum. He just didn't wake up one day and was evil, right? There's a good chance there was some evil done to him, and we need to wrap our head around what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, that was an element of the reporting we did in the Sun Times from the beginning. We had sources that said he'd been victimized as a kid, and that's a tragedy. There's nothing
Right.
else you can say. Is it right to separate the art from the misdeeds that the man did in public? Can we do that?
It's a hard discussion. I mean, we could have this discussion about Miles Davis. There were always rumors about Bill Withers, for a time in the 1970s. We could take it forward to a Chris Brown.
Yeah.
Even most recently, Rick Ross, though we're talking about lyrical content in terms as opposed to actual behavior. It's really difficult to me because there is a way in which clearly the lives of these artists affect the kind of music that they make. I mean, R. Kelly is a great example. R. Kelly's made this kind of move to retro soul in part to create some sort of cognitive distance between the kind of music that he had largely been associated with and the behavior that he was accused of.
Yeah, but on the other hand, he's doing umpteen more chapters of Trapped in the Closet, which is nothing short than a operatic epic about sexual weirdness.
Yeah, and I write about that's actually what I write about in the book. I try not to spend too much time talking about R. Kelly musical genius, but I spent all this time trying to unpack those first 22 chapters, and I think there's an admission there.
Yeah.
I think there are more than a few accusations. I mean, I think what he puts on the table is really how messy and funky black life can be. Also with this kind of aura of what we call black respectability. I mean, he's kind of playing both sides of the fence here, and almost saying, from that great line, and I wish, instead of y'all throwing stones at me, somebody pray for me. And it's like, it's clear R. Kelly needed to be prayed for a long time ago, but he's also suggesting that there's so much really funky stuff up in black life that, he's not an abnormality, right? He is a kind of product of a certain kind of pathology, that exists not only in black communities, but, communities at large.
What does it say that Pitchfork, which is the most successful independent underground publication since Rolling Stone, 1967, right? Largely a white audience. What does it say that they celebrate his music?
I think it says a couple of things, right? And you know this, you know, from your own work, Jim. I mean, folks have very short cultural memories. You know, if I go into a class of my undergraduates now, you know, most of which are 17, 18, 19 years old, they really don't have fresh memories of that R. Kelly. You know, R. Kelly might be for them the creepy old guy, you know, but they don't think about him as a sex offender. Right?
I remember the Chappelle skit.
Right. Right.
The Chappelle skit,
right. They might know him for the Chappelle skit. Right. That would be the context in which they would know them. But for a Pitchfork audience who really doesn't have an investment in both, you know, R. Kelly's cultural meaning to the black community musically, but also in terms of his persona as this predator, they have no investment in that. You know, for them, it's a headlining artist who's done some really interesting kind of retro soul music that on the one hand makes them look good because it articulates a certain kind of diversity that they have in terms of genre and obviously in terms of racial acts. But at the same time, because they don't have to be accountable, you know, to a black community that's still working through all these kinds of messy issues in their communities, in which R. Kelly, of course, is a symbol of that, you know, they don't have to make those kind of choices. You know, who holds Pitchfork accountable in this case? If it's not you, Jim, right, or someone like that, who holds Pitchfork accountable for making that kind of choice? You know, it's funny, I'm here at Duke now, and there's this ongoing conversation about the fact that, you know, Duke does these last day of class concerts. So it's a double bill, Kendrick Lamar and Travis Porter. And there's been a lot of conversation about the highly sexualized language and lyrics of Travis Porter. So much so that there's this kind of pushback, you know, is this the act that we need to have there? The fact of the matter is that we're not having this conversation about R. Kelly. You know, right. Travis Porter's, you know, we're talking about sexualized lyrics, right? In the case of R. Kelly, we're talking about someone who was accused of raping underage children and has shown a consistent pattern of that kind of behavior.
You know, I'll disagree with you about one thing. I don't think Pitchfork is fond of the steppin' music, the retro soul. Pitchfork is fond of Sex in the Kitchen and Sex in the Jungle and Trapped in the Closet and I Want to Ride You Like I Ride My Jeep and Bump and Grind.
There's always been this kind of weird hipster interest, for lack of a better way to describe it, in R. Kelly. I mean, even all of the conversation, you know, about Trapped in the Closet. I mean, yeah, there's the kind of black Twitter conversation about it, and there's the black barbershop and beauty parlor conversation about it. But when you think about, you know, it being on the IFC channel, you know, in terms of the debut, right, it really was speaking to a particular hipster element. And of course, from Kelly's standpoint, you don't know whether or not they're laughing at him or with him. I mean, there's lots of folks who've written about that particular dynamic. So, yeah, I get you in terms of Pitchfork, you know, being attracted to that idea, you know, of having someone like R. Kelly on stage.
And how does that make you feel?
You know, if I'm R. Kelly, I'm embarrassed. But I'm sure R. Kelly, you know, who's had many reasons to be embarrassed, you know, probably doesn't process it in this way. You know, you're always stuck with R. Kelly because, you know, if you're serious about the art is significant, but, you know, as you're talking about, it's hard to separate the art from the behavior. You know, it's hard to separate the art from the man. And as you suggest, I mean, it's become a part of his shtick. Yeah. Right. It's become part of his shtick in that regard.
So it's not us that won't let him forget. It's parcel of what he is.
What he is, right. It's you know, the book, you're looking for Leroy, the book is really about this idea of legibility, and there is a way that R. Kelly now is only legible to us in relationship, you know, to behavior around underage girls.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, I'm not an African-American man. You are. Let's say you're at the crowd at Bonnaroo, and he's performing to 100,000 white Dave Matthews Stoner fans. Let's say you're at the crowd at Pitchfork, and he's performing to 30,000 white hipster Pitchfork lovers. What does that interaction with that audience, those audiences, say to you?
See, I'm for one, I can never quite figure that out. You know, he's not Usher, right? He's not Chris Brown, in which, you know, music that is inherently contemporary. there's some sort of weird disconnect with Kelly, in particular with that particular audience, right? Because I'm not even sure how well any of them would know the music. I mean, R. Kelly's music doesn't really circulate that way in a kind of broad mainstream way. You know, in some ways, he's a very acquired taste. You know, R&B audiences, R&B radio. You know, he's never really had the kind of crossover success like, say, an Usher, for instance, and in comparison, except for things like, you know, the big kind of happy anthems like I Believe I Can Fly and things like that. And so I think part of, you know, what I would be watching, and it's hard for me to think of myself in this audience as just an African-American man, right? I would always be African-American male critic.
Right.
In this audience, right? And so I'm watching as much what he's doing on the stage as I am watching their aspect to them. So they're almost as much listening to the music as they are consuming the. And I'm sure R. Kelly is savvy enough as a performer and as a businessman at this point to know how to play up those antics for this particular audience. You know, I won't say that, you know, it's almost on a level of cooning, the way that we would think about, you know, how folks talked about, say, Louis Armstrong, you know, when he stopped playing the trumpet and it all became about the singing. You know, I wouldn't quite describe it that way, but he clearly is kind of playing up the affect of these certain kind of antics in terms of who he is, what we know of him, and what he thinks the audience wants to consume in that performance. Right.
So you're saying that this is a tailored shuck and jive?
I think there's no question about that. I'm sure the show that we see at Pitchfork is not the show that R. Kelly would do to a largely black audience in Chicago or Detroit or Orlando.
And what's fascinating is I've seen him perform in Chicago, obviously, but also outside of Chicago, in Austin, in New York, and it's almost always a 40, 50-year-old middle-class black audience.
Right.
100%.
Right. You know, where and that's where part of his genius is, because for that audience, you know, he can riff on Jeffrey Osborne and Lenny Williams and all these kind of folks, Ronald Isley, and that audience would get those references in a way that a Pitchfork audience would not get those references.
Is it therefore distasteful that what is the Pitchfork or Bonnaroo audience getting from him other than the super sexual freak caricature and some good grooves that they're not going to get from, you know, Grimes?
You know, there's always been this long-going conversation, and we can go back to Mailer and, you know, the White Negro and all this kind of literature from that period of time. You know, the idea that the black male performer, you know, becomes a symbol, you know, for white masculinity, white people in general, to define a kind of freedom in their freakishness. You know, that without the presence of that symbol, they can't cross over into this other world. But once that symbol occurs, you know, broadly defined as, you know, Chuck Berry and rock and roll in some sort of context, when we think about Teddy Pendergrass at the height of his popularity in the late 1970s and a decade is defined as the decade of sexual freedom. If you think about even Frank Ocean, you know, in some ways, you know, in terms of R. Kelly becomes this symbol for folks to be able to have a comfort zone or freedom, you know, to go over into this world of freakishness. Right, and ultimately to be able to blame it on R. Kelly, right, and black masculinity, and a pathological black sexuality.
Okay, but I know Mike Reed, African American promoter of Pitchfork. I think he does incredible work. Pitchfork the Festival, and I know Ryan Schreiber, the founder and the editor and publisher of Pitchfork. I know that if I had them here, they've refused to talk to me about this. I know if I had them here, I would say, do you gentlemen think that it's right for a 40 or 50-year-old man to have sexual relations with a 14-year-old girl and then leave her devastated to the point where she attempts suicide, or leave her life ruined in some regard, get her pregnant and take her for an abortion, as happened in one case? They would say, no, absolutely not.
Right.
Am I wrong to say, well, then why did you book this man to perform for 30,000 Chicagoans who support your festival and support your publication?
I don't think that's an illegitimate question. I think we always have to hold people accountable for the kinds of choices that they make. I'm sure their official response would be, you know, the truth of the matter is that he was acquitted. right? And whatever else existed, right, hasn't come into the public domain. So we're not going to hold him accountable, right? For and you know, it's very different than to say the Mike Tyson case, you know, because these elements come up again in terms of, particularly now, this kind of celebration of Mike Tyson. And folks forget, you know, young folks don't even know that, you know, Mike Tyson is a convicted rapist.
Yeah.
And you know, part of the argument you can make with Mike Tyson versus R. Kelly is that at least, you know, a la Michael Vick, you know, Mike Tyson served his time, right? You know, he served his time, right? So can he move on? With R. Kelly, it's more dicier because, you know, he was acquitted. You know, even though it's almost common knowledge, right, particularly around Chicago, of what his pattern of behavior was for a 20-year period.
It is documented, and there is that horrible videotape. And anyone who has seen that tape, I've never asked you, did you ever see that tape?
I have not seen the video. That is one of my kind of like claim to fame.
Yeah.
You know, that I've never seen the videotape, right? And again, you know, that's when we all get, we've talked about this before, I mean, that's when we all get kind of complicit in this whole dynamic. You know, all those folks who, you know, would never co-sign, you know, on sex with underage people, you know, boys or girls, who watched the video and felt, you know, comfortable enough sending the link to somebody or calling somebody over and go take a look at this, and didn't realize or didn't think that they were also trafficking in child pornography, and not see how they are complicit, almost just as complicit as R. Kelly in this regard.
Right, so there's a bit of guilt. There's a bit of guilt if you stand in that crowd and enjoy that set. There's a bit of guilt if you book him. I guess there's a bit of guilt in me having written about the tape. We're all a little dirtied by this.
I tell you, Jim, you know, God forbid you weren't doing that kind of work at the time. You know, that you don't get that, you know, VHS, you know, in your mailbox. And, you know, he continues this behavior, except now he has access to HD cameras. Mm-hmm. Right, and we have this whole broadband world where any of this stuff could have just popped up on, you know, on YouTube in ways that were fundamentally impossible to think about, you know, 2001, 2002. You know, it could have been even much more of a mess in that regard, but it also might have provided much more of a paper trail, you know, or a digital trail in this case, you know, for Kelly.
I don't think I've ever asked you this question, Mark. Is there anybody in society who matters less than the young black woman? I mean, we all know the young black man arrested while driving black, all right? But boy, the young black woman, the fact that every one of these victims, dozens of young women, were black, if there had been one white girl from Winnetka,
it'd be a totally different conversation.
Yeah, it would have.
Absolutely. It would have been a totally different, there is no question about that. It's not, I don't even think that's debatable. When you think about the role of young black girls and how we think about them in society, they're always the sacrificial lambs, right? And they get sacrificed to protect, in this case, black men who are of certain kind of prominence, if not necessarily power. I mean, you're in Chicago, and you know, the same Chicago that produced Mel Reynolds, you know, in terms of another kind of version of this story. Yeah. And of course, all the conversations are about, you know, well, you know, she led him into this. Right, she was so alluring. You know, the culpability is always on black women who are the victims, and black girls who are the victims.
Kanye, a man who knows better, calls them gold diggers. Right. Right. Gold diggers, bitches, and hoes.
Yeah,
that's it. Okay, so young female fans, young male fans of Pitchfork of Conscience bought a ticket because they want to see Bjork, bought a ticket because they want to see Wire and the parquet courts and Savages, right? Or bought a ticket to Bonnaroo, right? Because they want to see stoner bands, okay? How do they voice their disapproval of R. Kelly, you know, is going to take the same stage that many of these other acts are going to take at this festival? Should they? You and me spend our lives thinking about pop culture, but what if you're just someone who wants to go to the festival, doesn't like R. Kelly being there? What do you do?
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's always a desire as an individual to divorce yourself from politics that are problematic. So I'm sure there are a bunch of folks who will voice their you know, displeasure with Pitchfork by not being there for the R. Kelly concert, right? And
we'll go home early.
And that's a choice, and that will make them feel good, that particular day. I think if we're interested in more kind of systematic pushback, I think fans who are very concerned have access to social media in terms of Twitter and Facebook and these kind of things, have the ability to voice those concerns to Pitchfork in very public ways. What was always the old adage that, you write a letter, to a magazine or newspaper complaining about the content, and they read that one, letter as being tenfold, 12-fold, 100-fold, and they take it seriously. We've heard all these stories about airlines, for instance, that when people tweet about how bad their airline service is, airlines respond immediately to that, and often very personally. I think for those folks of conscience who are really concerned about this choice by Pitchfork, that's a way for them to go. And to have this conversation, more openly, in terms of the blogosphere and other places, are we really at this point where we're going to use folks who have a history of sex with underage people, with children, who have been accused of this, acquitted, whatever, do we want them to be headlining our concerts, right? Do we want our brand to be associated with this kind of person?
Mm. But do you want that to represent the Chicago music community? I guess is what the particular question of Pitchfork is.
And I'm sure there are folks, R. Kelly fans who, even in that context, would be protective of R. Kelly.
Oh,
right?
sure.
Because when you say, why is he here at our concert, that can be read in many different kinds of ways. That's why the R. Kelly thing is always, we could be talking to R. Kelly. We mentioned Mel Reynolds, the former mayor of D.C. It's that always odd, strange behavior where these men who clearly have been accused of heinous things, this need to close ranks around them. And I think R. Kelly understood very early in this process that there was going to be a strong segment that were going to be willing to close ranks around him. And once he realized he had that level of support, once he realized radio programmers, after deciding for, 8 or 9 months that they weren't going to play his music, were suddenly willing to put him back on the playlist because that's what the fans demanded. He realized he had a flank around him, and so he was pretty much protected. And then once he was acquitted, it was game over.
Yeah, it was Teflon. He's Teflon.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mark, any final thoughts on how can we admire the music but not the man?
Well, let me ask you, have you read the book?
I read parts of it. Remember the weird remix and extended rock opera version of I Believe I Can Fly?
I play it for my students every once in a while. Yeah.
Right. As I recall, he shows up at the pearly gates, and St. Peter's debating whether to let him in, and he tearfully says, "Forgive me of my horrible sins. They're horrible, horrible crimes I've committed.
Right.
But I'm fundamentally good. Let me in." That's how the book read to me, book length, published by Tavis Smiley. Wow. But, nobody's stepping forward and saying, A, what were those crimes? And B, how about we hear from your victims of these crimes that you say you committed?
Yeah. And I know, Tavis took a lot of heat. Here you have this book imprint, and you represent a certain kind of progressive politics within the black community. I understand you wanting to kind of give R. Kelly a space to tell his story, but how is not read as problematic? But at the same time, this is the same Tavis Smiley that's also been in cahoots with Walmart, for the longest time, so, people make the decisions that they make.
Do you think he has a responsibility to come clean about what those sins were that Kelly does?
I think he does. I think he assumes that we all know, and we write it off as part of the normal pathology of black community, so he really doesn't have to. I think he buys into the fact that there's a black community that really still doesn't want the dirty laundry of black life exposed. And by him sitting down with Barbara Walters or going on 2020 or The View, would be a moment of him airing his dirty laundry in a certain kind of, way. And I think he knows that protects him. Ultimately, right? This fear of the airing of the dirty laundry is the thing that ultimately will create a kind of silence within the black community. It's the Marvin Gaye stuff. The way that, all kinds of things around Marvin Gaye's behavior with young women, one young woman in particular, gets kind of silenced because, you know, that stuff can never come out because it damages the general perceptions of what black life is, right? And so we just don't talk about it. It's, you know, we mentioned about what if they were white girls. I mean, imagine what the narrative would be like if this was Justin Timberlake.
Oh,
and we were talking about 17, 18, 19 black girls, right? It's, you know, it might not have gone to a criminal trial, but the narrative and the discourse within the black community would have been fundamentally different, right? I mean, Justin Timberlake is still, I won't say punished, but even heavily criticized for protecting his brand, you know, around the Janet Jackson nipple game. You know, there's folks, you know, who didn't want to go out and buy the new album because they're still mad at Justin Timberlake because, you know, he didn't close ranks around Janet.
Right, and protect her. Yeah, a woman fully capable of protecting herself. She could get both
herself.
Of them.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
That's what we love about Janet. All right. Well, a lot of food for thought, Mark. Good luck on the new book, and thank you so much for helping me. It sounds like you don't have a lot more solid answers than I do.
No, not at all. I mean, that's what makes Kelly so fascinating, right? And now he's going to give us more volumes of this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, and give him some credit. I mean, he understood very early, particularly with this broadband stuff happening, that this visual realm would be the place where he could live.
Yeah.
You know, for the rest of his career, and not have to solely rely on selling music anymore.